Welcome to Securing Your Brand with SecureMark Legal. On this podcast, we break down the legal side of branding and protecting your business without the legalese. From trademark, copyright, and contracting tips to real-world case studies, we're here to help you safeguard your business, your brand, and reputation. We are here to help entrepreneurs, creatives, and business owners protect what they've built through smart, strategic IP solutions.
Welcome back to Securing Your Brand with SecureMark Legal, the show where we break down the legal tools every entrepreneur needs to protect their business. I'm Holly McFall, a trademark attorney and your co-host today.
And I'm Melissa Jeda, also a trademark attorney. Together, we help entrepreneurs, startups understand how to protect and grow their brand through intellectual property and business strategy. We talk to founders, innovators, and entrepreneurs about how they build their business, the lessons they've learned, the roles intellectual property play in protecting their brand along the way.
Today, we're thrilled to welcome James Kell. James has a fascinating journey from starting out in construction and running major projects like Apple's first retail stores in Australia to founding the adventure sailing school Sailing Virgins, to now being the CEO of Scratchie, an app that transforms workplace culture by rewarding positive behavior instead of punishing mistakes.
His story touches every entrepreneur on branding, safety, and leadership, all things we love to dig into. James, thanks for joining us today.
Pleasure, Melissa and Holly. Great to see you.
All right, James, let's start from the beginning. You've spent a lot of your career in construction, from apprentice carpenter to running large projects. Can you tell us about that journey and what lessons from construction shaped how you think about business and leadership today?
Yeah, so I started, as you said, my father was a builder, his father was a builder, and so on, as far back as we can go. And so it was sort of laid out for me when I was a teenager that I'd spend my holidays working on the sites. And then as soon as I finished high school, I was an apprentice carpenter. And then I also studied construction management at uni. So it was like one of those part-time things. And construction's really interesting. It really breeds leaders because you're having to motivate people all the time from a very young age. You've got this collection of people, some of whom you know, some of whom you don't, and you have a clear objective, which is the building. And so I found looking back that it was a really great little crucible for leading and managing people. And I've been able to bring that into other areas, such as the other businesses that I've been involved in and started.
This wasn't a small company that you were running. This was quite a large construction company that you were running towards the end of that career.
Yeah, the company was some of the projects it was involved in was the Houses of Parliament in Australia's capital city, Canberra, in the new Parliament House, and we built all the first dozen Apple stores in Australia.
It can be. Construction industry can be quite a tough industry. Definitely creates leaders in that. What point did you start feeling that you were ready to go on your own? You wanted to do your own adventure and, go beyond construction.
I was about 5 years into being the CEO, and I wanted to not be running a construction company. It's quite difficult to exit when you have equity in the business, and I ended up sailing across an ocean and pressing reset and starting pretty fresh, actually. And that the sailing is what got me into Sailing Virgins. I spotted a gap in the market where sailing was really for kind of the older crowd, sort of baby boomers. They tend to have money and time. And so the entire market was looking for those older people. And so they were ignoring, there was no really good products for the younger crowd, for the millennials. And so we started. On the surface, it's not as attractive, but when you niche in almost anything, then you give yourself the opportunity to be the leader. And so in that niche, because you can create a better product than anyone else, because you're the one that's focused on it. And that's what we found with Sailing Virgins, was that we could lead in that niche, and it might not have been as big a TAM, as big a total addressable market as the baby boomers in sailing, but it wasn't blood red with competition either. It was quite a blue ocean, as they say.
That's quite a shift from construction to sailing. That is a big change between, from one industry to a completely separate and different industry. That is quite a shift.
I mean, it is a shift. I mean, and yet there's so many things that rhyme in businesses. That's what I found. And yeah, ultimately I've come full circle back in the industry with Scratchie, solving for that problem. But yeah, it's funny how it seems very, very different, but there are many similarities in almost every business, I think. Needing to solve a problem, needing to find great people who also enjoy solving that particular problem. Those sorts of things really so the common denominator in business is I think understated.
That's true. You run an operation, you're running a business, you're running a large corporation, you're a CEO of a corporation, to shift into the position of another one is kind of the same role, but that's a completely different industry, a different,
True.
product, a different customer, a different employee base. That's a complete different industry. So it is quite a shift. The name Sailing Virgins, though, that's quite different. Walk us through how you came up with that name.
I really like simple names, but it was very straightforward. It was sailing and it was in the Virgin Islands, and it happened to be dedicated to millennials. So, rather than calling yourself some kind of generic kind of name, I wanted to have something that stood out a bit, was a little bit interesting and a little bit edgy. And so we actually looked for Virgin Sailing, and that was not available, funnily enough. So we went for Sailing Virgins, and we were able to get the .com for that, which was great. And then we thought we'd register the trademark, which was a whole nother story.
So when did you realize that it needed trademark protection? What was that process?
It was pretty early on. I think it was one of those, I didn't know much about registering trademarks. We certainly didn't, when we were in China, register China Climb. I sort of thought having the .com was sufficient, but I thought this brand can be something. I wanted to make something out of it. So it's like, well, you definitely need to treat it as any asset, and you got to protect it. And so I didn't really know what I was doing. And so I thought, well, I'll just find for that particular trademark, we found an attorney and we had them file it, but then Virgin Enterprises came back to us and denied us. So they said, no, you can't. It's got Virgin in the name. We have Virgin, so you can't. And it was real David and Goliath, actually. So, so we were like, no, you can't not let us call ourselves Sailing Virgins, because it's in the Virgin Islands. They don't own that name. And so they were being kind of bullying. And so I ended up writing and Richard Branson lives in the Virgin Islands. So I wrote to Virgin Enterprises Limited in London and said, guys, like, you're being the very bully that Richard Branson rallied against in the 90s, with his Dirty Tricks campaign. I don't know if you remember that, but when British Airways were really trying to bully him big time, and he called it the Dirty Tricks campaign, and he was David and Goliath, but he was David at that time.
Right.
And so
now
I
he's
was like,
Goliath.
guys, you're not being fair at all. And in fact, as it turns out, it just needed to see somebody from Virgin Enterprises Limited with some kind of strategic nous just needed to see what was going on, and they said, no, that's fine. But we really needed to push pretty hard and not accept the denial. Had we accepted the denial, we would never have been called Sailing Virgins, but we ended up just sticking to our guns.
Yeah, Virgin Enterprises definitely has a strong brand, and they police that brand and they make sure they protect it. They're registered in a number of classes, number of categories for different descriptions for different goods and services. And they do adamantly protect that. They work really hard to do such. They have quite a number of filings of
Yeah.
oppositions and going through that process. Um,
Yeah.
but as a lot of people find out when you go against another company, as long as you are descriptive of different product, different services of what you're doing, and you're not being descriptive of the actual goods or service, you can get a registered trademark, but sometimes it does take a battle to get there.
Yeah, that's right. And I look, to give them credit, they were about to start their Virgin Cruises, and here's some upstart sailing business, and they were like, just don't pretend to be Virgin. Basically, they were saying, we don't want any confusion in the market. And as soon as we gave them that, we had to give them that assurance. We were like, look, we have no interest in that. This is who we are. This is what our market is, and we're not going to be doing anything like that. And as soon as they had that confidence, then they were fine.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. What things seem like on the surface as an issue in a trademark filing isn't always what's really going on underneath. A lot of times we will get oppositions to filings that we make, and the oppositions are really bold and, just saying that you need to stop. There's no way you can possibly use this name. We're going
Exactly.
after damages. They just go kind of all the
Totally.
way, very intense. And then, we just give them a call and kind of say, what's really going on here? Or this is what our client is really doing. Maybe it's not what it seems like on the surface. And a lot of times, just through those conversations, you find out what their real issue is. And if you can
Yeah.
pinpoint that, a lot of times we can work things out with coexistence agreements, consent agreements, things like that, without going through a lengthy legal battle to get where we want to be.
It's so true. And I think in the Virgin case, they need to, their brand is of being someone who's innovative and fair and customer first, and it's a very clean brand. And to be seen to be trying to squash somebody who's trying to really having a go at creating a business, they don't want that either. And we
Right,
sensed that. And so we sort of pushed that towards them as well and said, guys, you gotta help us, but just not squashing us,
right.
and so they were really good. Yeah. So credit to Virgin Enterprises Limited.
It's good to be able to work through those things and figure out where each person can exist, each company can exist in the market. It's important to have that. Commerce and market is really important, but also making sure you're staying in your lane and not infringing on someone else's trademark and brand. Making sure yours is distinct. So it's important in both those aspects. It's important to police it and make sure that you have broad enough protection that no one else is traveling within your scope and your space. But it's also important to make sure that we have market and that we can continue to proceed, with commerce and in the market.
Well, exactly. And I mean, of course, like anyone who's successful has carved their own path. So to try and ape some other brand and expect success is I don't know, it's not how I think, at least, you know. And none of my heroes in business have ever thought like that either. They've always carved their own path.
So, James, fast forward to today. You're the CEO of Scratchie. For listeners who may not know, what is Scratchie and what problem were you setting out to solve when you created it?
Yeah, so full circle back to construction, we noticed, well, when I say we, my safety manager, I had my safety manager report to me, which is quite unusual in construction, but I wanted to stay very close. And the safety manager and I were very close as a result. We used to talk daily. And we noticed that the industry was changing to being one of sort of high, like almost like playing. I don't know if you have rugby league. No, you have American football, but it was like a kind of like a real team sport sort of atmosphere. And it became kind of almost sterilized through all these compliance and safety rules and that sort of thing. And the rules wouldn't really activate until you did something wrong, and then they would jump all over you. And it had this effect on the vibe and on the spirit in the construction site. And we were remarking on this, and at the time that we were kind of observing this and playing around with different ideas, and my safety manager Gary used to be he was like a professional bass guitarist in a band for 10 years. Like, he wasn't from the typical safety mold, right? And so we were both looking at the problem differently, and we were like, well, why don't we invert it? And later on, one of my business heroes, Charlie Munger, basically said that. He said, if you ever wanted to solve a problem, then invert it and have a look at it from that angle. And we had actually done that before we heard that quote. And we said, instead of punishing for a lack of safety, why don't we look at rewarding for a presence of safety and see what happens when we do that. And at that time, Apple was just coming to Australia to build the first Australian store. And we were one of 3 construction companies bidding for the job. And we sort of thought that we could put that to them as a safety innovation, is that we would reward for safety by giving scratch cards, custom scratch cards, to anybody on the site who did things well. And Apple loved it, and we won the job. So then we had to actually execute on it. So we went from sort of selling that we did it to actually having to actually do it. And we found that it had a really good impact, and it really lifted people's spirits. And now we know that it's this dopamine spike that you get when you are anticipating some kind of reward that you might or might not get. And there's a lot of psychology behind that. And over and that was 13 years ago, actually, when we first did the very first analog version of Scratchie. And then 8 years later, I was out of the industry. Like I said, I was starting up Sailing Virgins and everything else. But I had a cup of coffee with Gary about 4.5 years ago and said to him, who took on that idea? And he said, nobody. And I was like, somebody needs to. So he and I teamed up, and that started Scratchie. And from then on, so we were there to solve the problem of construction safety, basically. How do you make construction sites safer and yet still high productivity, high engagement, high morale, all those things? Can you get all those things together? And that was for construction. But then when McDonald's heard about it, they were really keen on it, and it was almost pre-sold. We sort of walked into the first meeting expecting having to sort of explain what it is, but they were like, no. If you're about rewarding for good work, good behavior in any form, we're a fan of that. And it was really interesting because they measure everything in McDonald's. In quick serve restaurants, they measure everything, and they knew how valuable this sort of instant reward for the right behavior was. So yeah, it was a slightly different problem we were solving in McDonald's, but I think the common denominator there was dopamine, right?
So they already knew the concept and supported it. They just didn't have a system in place to take advantage of that yet.
Yeah, they were like, finally, there's a product that can do what we've been needing to get done.
Mm-hmm. Nice.
They've got a teenage workforce, and teenagers, their brains are wired kind of differently. Well, they're wired differently, like break. They're also wired differently than we were at that age because of devices and dopamine. And so they need more dopamine in their everyday life than, say, we do. And whether that's a good or a bad thing, it's just a thing. And so we provide that instant reward, that dopamine recognition, and it's very necessary for this age group in particular.
And that really is kind of flipping the usual, you get in trouble for bad behavior, to you're being rewarded and positive for good behavior, to encourage that dopamine hit, to encourage that going forward. It is a definite, flip of how normal corporate world and, safety or things along those lines work. It's definitely an
100%.
inversion of that.
Yeah, so let's talk about the name. Scratchie is catchy, fun, and very different from typical safety tech branding. How did you land on that name, and what role did trademark considerations play while you were securing it?
Right. So Scratchie is, so Australians shorten everything. Like everything is just how
Yeah,
we
I don't
talk,
think
right?
Americans are going to understand where that comes from and what that, where that
Yeah.
Yeah.
idea comes
Yeah.
from.
So it's funny because so scratch lotto or scratch cards, is something that you probably have. You buy them and at the newsagent, and then coffee on a Saturday morning, you'll scratch one, or you give it to your nana for her birthday or something like that, or she'll give it to you for your birthday or something like that, right?
Yeah.
And so you scratch them and you win 10, 20, 50 bucks, whatever. And it's all fun. So in Australia, they're called scratchies.
Okay.
And so, yeah, we thought we'd make people associate scratchies in Australia with something like that. It's unexpected. You might win something, it's not gambling, but it sort of is, it's on the edge. Scratchie, our business is not at all gambling.
Again, it's that reward system. You're getting that,
It's the reward.
what am I
Yeah.
getting for this?
Yeah. The scratch lotto is essentially gambling, but Scratchie, what we do, is not at all gambling. It is rewards. Now we knew it was going to be challenging. We bought the .com because of course Americans don't use the word Scratchie, so we could get the .com quite easily. And so that was good. And then we thought, okay, now we need to protect this. And what the difference with this was, Scratchie is a word that's kind of in use in Australia. And so how were we going to navigate to actually get a trademark on something that's pretty much in use? Well, firstly, we found a good lawyer, a good trademark lawyer in Australia. And we knew we'd have to pay for that. And that was a really good move because they had the right strategy at the start, and it was just solid, good trademark law, and they ticked all the boxes, and we managed to get in 2 classes that were relevant to us, the trademark for Scratchie in Australia. So that was really handy because I think I didn't tell you, well, I haven't told the listeners that I made a mistake before, and the lesson I learned from that mistake, I saved money, so to speak, in getting a trademark for our port and starboard marks on the t-shirts for sailing virgins. And I basically lost them because this cheap kind of trademark attorney didn't fill in all the forms or do what was necessary, and we lost it. And so at that point I was like, okay, I've learnt the lesson. And so when we came to filing for Scratchie, we had a good attorney here in Sydney to help us, and it was fine. It worked well.
And you're not describing a lotto ticket. You're not describing the actual goods or service that you're providing. Though Scratchie does mean something in Australia, where it may not mean something to us Americans. It's not, you're not trying to trademark for what it is. You're not trying to trademark Apple for, apple cider vinegar or an apple orchard or something along those lines. You're trademarking Scratchie for your new product and innovation. Though you're using a name that people understand, it's not for a lotto ticket. It is the positive reward system. It is a different product or service in this case than a lotto ticket, which is what Scratchie technically means.
Yeah, and that's right. And that's where we needed the help, was to define what it was that we were doing and which classes we would be going in for. And that had to be done in a way that that our Scratch Lotto people would not push against, basically, because they were really the only ones who would have an issue with it. And yeah, as it turns out, it wasn't a problem, and we have the trademark, and it's all well and good.
That strategic planning is really important, that having a conversation from the start. I want to trademark this. This is my idea. This is my brand. For entrepreneurs, having this conversation from the start with a trademark attorney, with an IP attorney, really gives you an understanding of, where you can go with the name. First of all, is the name available? Can I actually own that name? Is it available? Like you said, with Sailing Virgins, you're like, I wouldn't have gotten Virgin Sailing, but it was the ability to understand the name, the market, and what was available. Yes, it was a fight, it was an argument, but you were able to eventually secure that name. It's important for entrepreneurs to understand sometimes this conversation has to happen right from the start, right from the beginning of your entrepreneur journey and, starting that business and going forward. I know it's a risk because are you going to build that brand? Is it going to turn into something? But that's important as part of the trademark strategy, is having this conversation from the launch of a new adventure.
It definitely is. And I loved your opinion on this. My thoughts were, if I can get the .com, then I'm off to a racing start. So I didn't want a boring name. And if you don't want a boring name, then there's a pretty reasonable chance that it's going to be a challenge in some way to protect it, because somebody else either has something similar or, is going to push back. And so I've never been afraid of a risk. Obviously, if you start a business, you're not afraid to take a risk. So the initial advice was, well, you sure Scratchie? Like, don't you want to find something that's a bit easier to trademark? And it was like, no, I want Scratchie. And so let's give it a go. And I know that we might not get it, but let's give it a go. So I would encourage, entrepreneurs or founders, if you've got a name that you like and it's not obviously copying, some company, because like who wants to do that? But if
you don't want to steal their goodwill, you don't want to be confusingly similar to them. You don't want to, cause market confusion from the start.
Exactly. Yeah. So, but definitely worth, like you say, having the conversation. Because later on, when things go well and you want to sell that business and you haven't protected the name, that's when it's should have, could have, would have. You really regret it. So you do have to treat the name like maybe the most important asset of a brand is its trademark, right?
And securing that .com is important. Making sure that's available, that the domain name is available, that you want is important. We tell clients to do an internet search, run that Google search and see if there is something out there in the market with a similar name to you before you come to us. Do your basic research when you're designing and coming up with a creative name. But you also want to make sure you run that through the USPTO, run it through maybe through Australia, make sure that which country that you're going to be in, where you sell, where you manufacture, where you ship your product, that name is available, to make sure that it is something that you're not going to confuse someone else on the market. And owning the website is super important to that process.
Yeah.
But it's where the conversation needs to start, not where it needs to end. Because like you said, coming after the fact, it can be too late.
Yeah. So that's where we are now. And yeah, we're talking to more quick serve restaurants, and we'll be in the States later on this year. So it's a pretty exciting journey for Scratchie.
So what's next for you? Is Scratchie what you do for the next 5 to 7 years?
I've still got the sailing business, and so I've got a general manager running that now. So I get involved in that a couple of weeks a year, which is lovely. I'll be in St. Martin at the end of next month for a week. And so that's great business to be involved with. But yeah, 95% of my time is Scratchie, and I love it. It's going to make a big impact in the workplace, and it already is making an impact. And when we're in the States in not too long, then that'll be a whole big adventure in itself. So yeah, I'm loving the Scratchie adventure.
Very nice. So the United States is next. That's the immediate next. Do you have a plan for the next after that?
Well, I mean, the United States is a huge market. So, and we're looking at 31 different sectors, construction being one of them, quick serve restaurants, retail, hospitality. So there's lots of sectors so yeah, it's a big market. And there's another Australian, that's a specialist safety company called Safety Culture, and they've done very well in the US market. And so we're emulating them in many ways. We're technology partners with them, and we've learned a lot from them. And so, yeah, I think our work is cut out focusing on the US market. That's for sure.
That certainly makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
For our startups that are listening today, what is your last piece of advice for the day?
My last piece of advice in terms of trademarking is, in terms of a name, I'd say it's got to be contradictory, what I'm about to say. So the first piece of advice is, don't think too long about your name. Don't obsess too much about your name. And then the second piece of advice, which contradicts somewhat the first, is once you have a brand name that you like, then go for it. Like, don't give up and get something boring sounding because someone said you might not be able to protect it or something like that. Like, if you've got it, so those two things, don't spend months and months and months trying to have a working title until you get a name that works, but don't spend ages on it because you have so many problems to solve. You have so many challenges in front of you when you start a business. You just need a name that, get a working title, don't spend too long. But then once you've got that name, then protect it.
James, it has been a fantastic conversation. We have covered so much, everything from starting a construction company and going through and building that brand to creating a whole new adventure on the opposite side of the world to workplace safety. Everything is important, as in protecting your brand, protecting what you do and what you work for. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Melissa. Thank you, Holly. It's a great chat.
And for our listeners who want to learn more, check out Scratchie.com to see James' current company in action. And thank you to our audience for tuning in. Don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and share this episode with a fellow entrepreneur who's building their brand. Until next time, I'm Holly McFall.
And I'm Melissa Jeda. This has been Securing Your Brand with SecureMark Legal.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.